Morning, everyone. Verity and Micah and myself are very glad to be here together with you this morning and to share this time. We've come from many different directions, I guess. Most of us in cars. Leon, I know, got here by taxi, and I saw Harry McLean turn up by skateboard, which is uber cool. I hope he's not teaching, Paul and Di to skate, but who knows, they might be very good at it. Over the course of this weekend, we've been considering the Spirit of God and its dynamic presence and energetic activity in our community and in our lives individually as believers. And we might just take a pause here and try and see whether we can get this up on the screen. I think the problem might be my laptop. We'll see if we can sort that out. So we've come this morning to the last of our 4 studies, and of course this is the most important meeting of all, because here together as the body of Christ, we commemorate, celebrate and reaffirm the new covenant. As Paul said, we are the true people of God who worship God in the Spirit and put no confidence in the flesh. Paul only came to this conviction through a complete rebuild. God took him down to the ground and then built him up again. There was a life before Damascus, a life in which God was a distant figure whose demands were impossible to meet, in which Jesus was the enemy, and in which he had not the remotest idea about the Spirit. And then there is a life after Damascus, a life in which it is impossible to be separated from the love of God, in which Jesus is our exemplar and our enabler, and in which the Spirit is present, active and powerful. Now, I don't know your story. Perhaps you went many years without taking any interest in God and Jesus at all. And then circumstances, perhaps a crisis or a tragedy or a growing sense of being fallible or frail, drew you irresistibly in their direction. Perhaps you remember being religious, conscientious, even scrupulous from your earliest years. And while religion dominated your thinking, you felt tremendous tension between who you are and God's demands and the expectations of your community. And your relationship with God and with Jesus was almost, a love-hate relationship. Perhaps you have been a fairly compliant Christian all your life, and you're not really conscious of a Damascus moment when suddenly the lights went on and your eyes were opened and you realised that you had been completely mistaken about God and Jesus and their purpose with you and with the church, and you determined to strike off in a new direction with new hope and new vigour. Well, certainly that was the experience of Paul, wasn't it? Or we should perhaps call him at this stage Saul the Pharisee. I mean, few of us feel the hunger and thirst for righteousness as intensely as Saul. He was a peculiar individual in a lot of ways, I'm sure you'd agree. He was psychologically sensitive. He was highly strung. He was perfectionistic. He lived in good conscience, but he was tormented by his failings. But the brilliant chroma of his struggle makes it easier for us to see with great clarity the terrible tension between sin and righteousness, the inherent disability of a law-based solution, and the life-changing solution offered to Saul and to us by God and Jesus through the Spirit. And so Saul the Pharisee, in his journey to Paul the Christian, has something tremendously powerful to say about life before Jesus and life after meeting Jesus. And that is what we shall look at this morning. Let's think for a moment about Saul under the law. It's quite plain when we look back to Romans chapter 7, the chapter before the one we read this morning, that this chapter describes Saul as a law keeper. It uses the word law, the Greek word nomos, 23 times. The commandment entele 6 times, and the writing grammar once. It's all referring to the law of Moses. And it talks about a man who's trying to give righteousness a red-hot go. When he talks about the law, he appears to mean the 10 words specifically, and he's got a particular sensitivity about the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet. You know, it's interesting, the first and the 10th commandments are both very detailed. I don't know if you've noticed that before about the 10 words. The first commandment, you know, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And it's deliberately trying to convey that everything is included in the way we should love God. Nothing is excluded. It must be 100%. The 10th commandment is similarly comprehensive. You know, you shall not covet, it says, and then it says your neighbour's wife, your neighbour's land, your neighbour's ox, your neighbour's donkey, your neighbour's servants, or anything that is your neighbour's. Again, it's trying to say, I'm talking about 100%, says God. You're not to covet anything at all. And it seems from the way Paul talks, and perhaps a couple of other clues from elsewhere in his writings, that covetousness was a particular problem for Saul. But when he looked for help in dealing with this problem, he found that he was completely on his own. Now, it may not be your problem or mine. You know, maybe we struggle with something else. But I'm sure we can identify with a man here who's trying to do the right thing, is struggling enormously with that, and finds he can get no help at all. In fact, these are the terrible realities of Saul's spiritual life. And first of all, some unrealities. If we'd read through Romans 7, the only reason we didn't do that is because it would just take up a little too much time this morning. If you read through Romans 7, from verse 7 to the end of the chapter, you will find that God is only mentioned, in the heart of it anyway, in verse 22, where Paul talks not even about God, but the law of God. That's the only reference to God in that whole section. So you can understand that what Paul's telling us is that when I was like that, God was just the distant lawgiver. I had no personal relationship with him at all. Jesus, of course, is entirely absent from Paul's thinking. If anything, he's the enemy. And the Spirit, well, it's there in some vague way. He says the law is spiritual. That's it. Nothing more. Certainly no sense of the activity of the Spirit in his life. So these are Paul's unrealities. And if we look for his realities, what we find that when he looks within, all he can find is the fatal compulsion of sin. And when he looks without to get some help with that, he sees the law, and that is crushing in its expectations and utterly powerless to help. Now let's have a look at that. First of all, the terrible reality of sin within. Come back to Romans chapter 7. In verses 7 to 13, Paul talks about the venomous snake. He talks about the ultimate effect of sin, and that is death. He says in verse 9, for example, of Romans chapter 7, I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. That what Paul's describing is the ultimate effect of sin, and that is death. And he speaks of it as if it's a problem within, like a venomous snake injecting him with its toxin. He cannot escape this terrible reality of sin within. And then he introduces another figure from verses 14 to 24. He talks about the immediate effect of sin, the compulsion to do the wrong thing, in terms of perhaps a slave master cracking his whip and driving Paul on. It's inescapable, this pressure to do the wrong thing. He's a sold slave, completely at sin's mercy. He cannot explain his actions. He agrees that the law is good and he wills to do what is good and right, but he finds himself compulsively doing what he hates. So he concludes in verse 20, now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. And there's no escaping the slave master that lives within. When I want to do what is good, he says in verse 21, and right, evil lies close at hand. There is no escape. And the presence of sin is so overbearing and overwhelming that he's conscious only of its presence. Nothing good dwells within me, he says in verse 18. And that's not strictly true, of course, for there's at least Paul's delight in God's law and his will to do what is good and right. There are good things. But he feels that sin's personality completely fills his inner space to the exclusion of his better self. And the compulsion to sin is so potent that he describes it as another law, the law of sin. Thus he's trapped in the body of this death, he says, a slave to sin, at war with himself and utterly wretched. Perhaps you've been there. Certainly there's times in my life where I've been there. And we look for help, don't we? Perhaps we talk to other people to see whether they can assist us. We flick through the pages of the Bible. Where's the verse or the passage that can tell me what to do, how to get some relief from this problem? Surely Saul can get some help from the law. That's the word of God, after all, in his day. Why can't he just do what it says? Isn't it that simple? Not for Saul. The law didn't help him at all. And so that's the second terrible reality that he had to deal with, that God's law was part of the problem, not part of the solution. That was his lived experience. And as we read through the chapter 7, we find sort of 5 ways in which Paul highlights problems with the law. He says, first of all, it creates categories of sin and it makes people aware of those sins. And so he says, it's there in verse 7. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet, if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Secondly, he said, the law gives life to sin. It activates sin. Apart from the law, he said, sin lies dead. It's there at the end of verse 8. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the covenant commandment came, sin came alive and I died. Previously, he was unconscious of sin, but now he's very conscious of sin. The law has given life to sin. The law arouses our sinful passions, he says back in verse 5. That's a challenging statement, isn't it? Verse 5, for while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. The law provokes, he says, our internal rebel. He says the law proliferates and multiplies sin. In verse 8, sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. I thought I had a problem before, says Saul, and now it's much, much worse. I can feel covetousness in so many different directions. It's proliferated and multiplied sin. And in verse 13, he says, I became sinful beyond measure. And then finally, he says that the law served sin by enacting sin's penalty. It killed me. It deceived me, and through it killed me, he said. It offered Israel a choice between life and death. But when Paul reached out to claim the promised life, he found that the law delivered death instead. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me and through it killed me. You've got to remember, this is a man giving righteousness a red-hot go. Nobody tried harder to keep the law perfectly than Paul. And yet, despite the virtues of the law, sin is so extraordinarily powerful, says Paul, that it is able to weaponise the law of God and turn it against me. Where's the problem? Well, we don't want to say that there's a problem with the law, do we? In itself, it's given by God, says Paul, and it's spiritual, it's holy and just and good. But the law has to be received and lived by human beings. And the point is that the law working from without cannot address the inner problem. That's where the problem lies. And so Saul is in a terrible situation. He's trapped between sin and the law, two devastating realities. He's at war with himself, his mind against the flesh, one law against another inside his being. He cannot escape the problem. It lives within him. His external resources are completely inadequate. His failure is chronic and comprehensive. And that's why he says, "O wretched man that I am, I so much want to do what is right all the time, and yet I fail again and again and again, and it's pushing me to the edge of sanity." Of course, it's not just men, is it? Although that phrase of Saul's is so well known. The T-shirt reads, by the way, "I am the wretch the song refers to." I'm sure we can all relate to that. So that was Saul's problem. And then came Damascus. Desperate to be rescued, Saul was confronted by Jesus on the road to Damascus. And in chapter 8, we see the second half of the story, which is Paul, the Christian. There's a whole new way of looking at life once we've met Jesus, says Paul. Once we have a personal relationship with God. Once the Spirit of God is at work in our life, life looks very, very different. I'm the same person, but how things have changed now that I have met Jesus on the road. Paul the Christian receives from God what Saul the Pharisee failed to achieve without God. And the difference is that God, Jesus and the Spirit have now gone to work in his life. A divine therapeutic from outside of Paul and working within Paul in a way that the law could not do, makes him a child and an heir of God, enables righteousness, promises him glorious life and ultimate freedom, engenders hope and endurance, and assures him of God's love. Well, 20 years after that moment, writing this letter to the Romans, how does Paul describe this new life of the Spirit? Well, we read at least the first 17 verses this morning, and thank you again, Maranatha, for that reading. You would have noticed all the way through the chapter that from I and me in chapter 7, it's all about Paul being locked in his own psyche. In this chapter, you might have picked this up. It's all about we and you and us. Paul is no longer the sinner struggling in isolation from Father, Son and Spirit. He's no longer burying his struggle under a superficial appearance of righteousness. He's joined the community of the Spirit, the family of God with its brothers and sisters, and he journeys in that company, sharing their faith, hope and love, as we do today. What a change. I mean, the flesh, the law and sin loomed large in Paul's previous life, but they're now confined to his past. The flesh is entirely supplanted by the Spirit. The law has been sidelined by the incarnation, the crucifixion and the resurrection of the Son, his life, his death and his new life. Sin has been dealt with once for all, condemned in its own fortress by one who came in the likeness of sinful flesh. And its place in Paul's psyche has been taken by Christ through the Spirit. God, Jesus and the Spirit, who were entirely absent from Paul's previous life, are everywhere present in chapter 8 of Romans. And as a result, Paul's tone is transformed beyond recognition. The struggle, failure, guilt, shame, fear, despair and wretchedness are gone. Everywhere in this chapter there is the note of confidence and victory. We might even ask, if we're sort of handed the two chapters side by side without any context, is it really the same person? Could that desperate and wretched person really be this same confident, victorious person in this chapter? And the answer is, of course, yes and no. There's been this dramatic change, and that has made all the difference. Now, what's the logic of that shift? Well, first of all, Paul says in Romans 8, chapter 1, you might like to turn there with me now, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who live in Christ Jesus. You might think that's put in the negative, and it's a little bit anticlimactic, but it's stated negatively because of Paul's intense spiritual anxiety. He knew himself to be a sinner. He expected God's damning verdict. Unexpectedly, he experienced God's grace. He was absolved of guilt. There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Why? Well, he says in verse 2, "For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death." There is a new law. Under the old law of sin and death, Paul stood condemned. He was sin's prisoner, but now he has been liberated by the law of the Spirit of life. Just have a look at those two phrases, the law of the Spirit of life and the law of sin and death. Conceptually, they're symmetrical, but there's an important difference. Instead of death, there's life. Okay, that parallel looks intact, doesn't it? Instead of sin, there's righteousness. Only Paul doesn't use that term. Probably, I think, because if he did, it would sort of direct attention to the, it might leave his readers with the notion that sin as human failure has now been replaced by righteousness as human achievement. And he certainly doesn't want to give people that message, does he? So instead he says it's the law of the Spirit of life which directs attention to the effectual means by which God brings about that state of righteousness in our being, the Spirit of God. It's the Spirit that enables righteousness, thus setting him free from sin, and gives life, thus setting him free from death. So that's Paul's new reality. And he talks about that from verse 3 onwards. What God has done by the law, for God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So this new law is the work of God. By Jesus and the Spirit, God has worked from within what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not work from without. He sent his own Son into our midst in the likeness of sinful flesh, and he condemned sin in the place of its power. And notice that God has condemned not sinners, but sin. He has fulfilled the righteousness intended by the law, not in the death of sinners, but in the life of saints who live and walk according to the Spirit, who set their mind on the things of the Spirit and thus please God. And the result is that the righteousness aimed at by the law becomes a reality in us. We walk according to the Spirit. Again, it's that idiom of walking, isn't it? Halacha, the term the Jews use for living a life that's obedient to the law. And Paul's sort of lifted that term and said, well, if you want to walk, let me show you how to walk. We walk according to the Spirit, and that will produce the result that walking according to the law can never do. We no longer respond willfully to the impulses of the flesh, but to the impulses of the Spirit, which express God's will for us. And in verse 5 then he says, we are therefore new creatures as a result of the Spirit's work. He says, those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. It's like Jesus said to Nicodemus, isn't it? That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Like gives birth to like. And so we now live according to the Spirit, because that is what has given us new life and new being as spiritual creatures. We manifest the logic of our kind. And instinctually we set our mind on the things of the Spirit now. We think quite differently. And the result in verse 6 is life and peace. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. Peace within ourselves, peace with other people, peace with God. Paul explains, verse 7, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot, says Paul. It doesn't submit to God's authority because it is without the power to do so, as his own eloquent testimony in the previous chapter has demonstrated. The law creates categories of sin, and it makes people aware of those sins. It activates sin. It provokes our inner rebel and arouses our sinful passions. It proliferates and multiplies sin. Sin has weaponised the law. Therefore, the mind of the flesh is hostile to God, and those who are in the flesh, verse 8, cannot please God. You, however, verse 9. So there's a radical contrast now, isn't there, with Paul and the Christians of Rome to whom he writes and to whom we belong. You, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if in fact the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now you notice, I don't know if you're one of those people who like to sort of colour in their Bible or make notes in their Bible, but you notice there's 4 conditional statements, 4 if statements from verse 9 to 11 in a row as Paul sort of spells out the change. If the Spirit of God dwells in... Now, Paul's not saying that because he's not using if in the sense of doubt. You know, maybe, maybe not. He's saying, we might say, since. It's a logical consequence. If this, then that. Because this condition is true, the computer programmers in the room know, this is coding 101. So they know how that works. If, then, right? Since this is true, the condition is fulfilled, the effect follows. So the Spirit of God dwells in us, and we are therefore in the Spirit, is his first statement. Negatively, he says at the end of the verse, anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. So he wants to be very clear in positive and negative, put them together. It's very clear what he's telling us, isn't it? Verse 10, if Christ is in you, although the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. The body might die because the wages of sin is death. We're born to die, aren't we? But there is a countervailing force now. The Spirit is life because of righteousness. And then in verse 11, that countervailing force is so powerful that if it dwells in us, says Paul, if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. So much depends, doesn't it, on the Spirit dwelling in us and Christ living in us. Paul's just coming back to that again and again. It just shows how important is this truth. Now, he talks in verses 12 to 16 about what it means to live as the children of God. So then he says, verse 12, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. We now owe God, if you like, and we want to do everything we can to live according to the Spirit. If you live according to the flesh, you will die, but if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. He says in verse 14, the mark of the children of God is that they are led by the Spirit of God. All who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. You did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. It's the slave mindset that Paul's talking about, isn't it? Cringing, anxious about what the master's going to say. He can demand anything he likes. He has the power of life and death. If I slip or make a mistake or, serve the meal a bit cold or smash a glass, I'm going to be thrown into the pond and eaten by the fish. Terrible things like that happened under the Roman Empire. Not common, thankfully, but there were masters who were like that. And so Paul's saying slaves live in fear. They're always anxious about what their master is going to demand next and where his judgment will fall. You haven't received that spirit. You've received the spirit of adoption as sons, children, by whom we cry. Here it is again, the cry of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Abba, Father. Paul urges us to receive that spirit. And he says the spirit that we've received in our spirit and the spirit of adoptions as sons by whom we cry, Abba, Father, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit, verse 16, that we are children of God. They speak with one voice and testify that we are now God's children. Receiving that spirit is what impels us to cry out to God as our Father. And he says, if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. And Paul describes this experience, as amazing and wonderful as it is, as just the first fruits of the Spirit. He uses that expression in verse 23. Not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit. So if you think this is fantastic, and Paul obviously thinks it is, right? It's blown his mind. It's made him Paul the Christian. And it's changed his life out of sight. I hope it does for you and for me as well. As amazing as that is, says Paul, it's just the first fruits. It's just that first sheaf brought in out of the field and offered to God as a thanksgiving. There's a whole field of fruit out there. There's so much more to come, says Paul, if we can just get on board with God's program and receive that first fruits of the Spirit. We groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as children, the redemption of our bodies. So there's so much more, the full revelation of God's glory in us is still in the future. We don't always feel strong and confident, but that is coming. But Paul gives an example now of how the Spirit helps us. It's an example of prayer with our prayer struggles. Verse 26. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. It's just an example, says Paul, of how the Spirit takes us at the moment when we are at our lowest, when we feel weakest, when we don't even know what to ask for from God. We don't even know what words to say. At such a moment, says Paul, the Spirit is there even then. The Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought. We can't think of what we need. We can't think of how to ask God for it. We are confused. We are directionless. We know we need help, but that's about as far as it goes. We can make no sense of our situation or of our response. But the Spirit of God is there. The Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. All we can do is just express emotionally to God how we are. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Well, what's Paul talking about here? There are two kinds of helpers, aren't there? There's those who do it for us or to us, and then there's those who do it with us. And the word that Paul uses here, helps us, in verse 26, is the second kind of helper. It's the kind of helper who says, we can do this. Let me roll up my sleeves and get alongside you. I'll pick up the tools and we'll tackle this task together. That's what the Spirit of God is doing with us. It gets alongside us, it rolls up its sleeves, and it assists us in the strenuous project of life. It's there when we need it most, and it's ready for action. And so that's what Paul is talking about here. We don't know what to pray for. We cast around, searching for answers, for comfort, for a way forward. And the Spirit is helping us to put those thoughts together, put the words together, get it to God, and then get things moving, get a response and a solution happening. Now we might think, well, sometimes we might think, well, theologically, is that all right? How do I put that together with intercession? And surely God knows anyway. So what's the point of prayer? We ask ourselves all of these questions. Paul's using a metaphor here. It's the metaphor of a king's court, where if you go to approach the king, you need a patron or supporter inside the court who can bring you to the king's throne and get his attention. It's not how it works with God, obviously. But God, Jesus and the Spirit are working together, says Paul, and he uses this concrete image, so we've got something to latch onto. They're working together to communicate our distress to God and to get help on our behalf. Now, we've got an example of this, actually. You might like to keep a piece of paper or something in Romans 7, because we'll come back here, Romans 8, we'll come back here to finish off. But just turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, because here's an example of this from the life of Paul. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I think I might have said first. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and Paul's giving an example here of exactly this. He says in verse 7 of 2 Corinthians 12, look, such wonderful visions God has shared with me. There's things I can't even put into words. Perhaps there's things I'm not even allowed to tell you. I don't know. But I have had these most extraordinary experiences, says Paul. And perhaps it's for that reason that God also gave me some pretty challenging trials, just to keep me in the right place. That's what he says in verse 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh. Was it something physical? Was it an enemy who would never give up, relentless on Paul's trail, hounding him, accusing him, undermining him all the time? We have to guess. It was something very difficult that Paul had to deal with. A messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Right, so what do? Surely I'd be better off without this. It's driving me nuts. Couldn't I be far more productive and fruitful if God would only take this problem out of the way? He doesn't know what to ask for, but he thinks maybe that's the solution. And he puts it to God 3 times, or to Jesus the Lord 3 times. Here's his response in verse 9. He said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you." I'm not going to take it away, Paul. Life will continue to be very difficult. But I am with you in that life. And my grace, all of the things I give you out of the riches of my heart to you, Paul, will be enough. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul said, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Now, he's talking about the Holy Spirit there. That's the term power is frequently used of the Spirit through the Scriptures, and that's what he's referring to. Christ, through the Spirit, will enable me to cope with a trial that seems unbearable. He won't take it away, but he will enable me to deal with it. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, paradoxically, then I am strong. So Paul had learned in his own experience, hadn't he, what he says back in Romans 8, verse 28. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. It doesn't mean that all things are good. They're not. And perhaps you, or perhaps people you know, have suffered enormous tragedy. There's no taking away the pain of that. And the consequences of it can be devastating. They're not good. But in all of those things, God is working for good for those who are called according to his purpose. He is with us in that darkest moment. He's there on our side of the board. He's walking alongside us. He's not doing it to us. He's helping to cope with this. He's being with us to help us cope with the situation. Those who are called according to his purpose. And he goes on to set out, doesn't he, in verses 29 and 30, this unbreakable chain that goes back before time, when God predestinated and foreknew, all the way through to the end of time, where he glorifies those he justified. All the way along that chain, from before time to after time, God is with us. And in his love, he's moving us along that chain, if you like, unto that final time when we experience the fullness of the Spirit, the redemption of our bodies. And Paul is deeply moved by the wonder of God's unbreakable goodwill. So we get these fantastic words in verse 31. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? They're rhetorical questions, aren't they? They're not meant to be answered, but the answer is, of course, no one. Right? If God is for us, then it doesn't matter. All the power of the enemy, said Jesus, is not enough. God is more than enough. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? Right? If you're still anxious about your sins and where you stand with God, who's going to be the person who gets up and accuses you before God? It's God who justifies. There's no answering that judgment, is there? Right? If God calls us righteous, that's the end of it. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Nothing. And he goes through the most extreme human experiences. And like I said, we've been touched by them ourselves. Maybe in our own experience or our extended family or our friends. Tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword. They're words here, but they express horrendous realities, don't they? And yet in all of them, says Paul, nothing and no one can separate us from the love of Christ. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, the most fundamental existential challenges to who we are, our being, are not enough to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. What a transformation from the distance and the despair of chapter 7. What a difference the presence and the activity of the Father, the Son and the Spirit in his life has made. Well, our experience will not be exactly parallel to that of Saul the Pharisee, will it? But we need to think carefully about what Jesus said to Nicodemus. You must be born again, or you cannot see or enter the kingdom of God. Nicodemus, your well-known scholarship, based on a lifetime's attention to reading and studying the scriptures, your membership of and fellowship with Pharisees, the most exclusive sect of our religion, Paul's description, your faultless life, your love for Israel, your desire to reform the people of God, your acknowledgement of me, none of these things, admirable in themselves, none of these things qualify you for the kingdom. You must be born again. For Jesus, the new birth from above by the Spirit was a radical experience. It's an absolute spiritual reset, and we must see it in his terms. And this morning, through the blood of the new covenant, God holds out to us that completely new arrangement which revolves around the Son and the Spirit. Take, eat. This is my body, which is given for you. Here is the new covenant in my blood. Drink ye all of it. It's here for the remission of your sins. And we're here this morning, gathered as the body of Christ, to participate together in remembering and celebrating that new covenant. What God has done, is doing and will do for us and in us. And so we need to take our lead from the Spirit-anointed Son. We need to open our heart to the absolute love, the love without limits that confronted the world on that black day in Jerusalem, and the brilliant early sunshine of the spring morning a few days later, when hope became not only possible again, but obvious, unarguable, unanswerable, undefeatable. And we need to welcome the Spirit poured out 7 weeks later, a mighty wind gusting through the house, slamming doors and rattling shutters and lighting a fire in the heart of God's people that should not be quenched and cannot be quenched. Through that Spirit, God still dwells here in this place and wherever people come to him in faith, hope and love. By that Spirit, he still inspires and enables and empowers his people. I'd like to finish with Paul's prayer. Just come over to Ephesians chapter 3. We'll finish with this. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 14. For this reason, says Paul, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.